Hello, welcome to my garage. Today I'll be talking you through gearbox and engine removal on an MGB. The job itself is fairly straightforward. You don't need much in the way of specialist tools. You will need an engine crane or a hoist, a set of axle stands, jacks and of course an imperial spanner and ratchet set. I've left the coolant and oil draining from the car overnight. This should hopefully make the job fairly mess free. So let's get started. Before we start removal, we have to disconnect the battery. In most cases that's under this panel in the rear of the car. On this vehicle I have a battery cut-off switch, so I'll just do that instead. Depending on the year of MGB you have, your engine bay may look a bit like this one. My general procedure for removal of the engine and gearbox is to take off the carburettor, manifold, alternator. I'll remove the whole radiator and shroud assembly, plus the oil cooler pipes. From there I'll move on to the underside of the car. On this side of the engine I've got a few hoses there that feed the oil catch tank. These just pull off. On your car you may not have these. The next part of the job is the Weber carburettor. This is held on by 1/2-inch head nuts. It also has a fuel supply on this side. In my case this is just a pop release, so I'll go ahead and take the carburettor off next. So I'm on to the final nut of the carburettor now, so I'll just take this last one out. What I'll do, I'm going to leave the throttle cable as it is and just going to take the carb up like that and then carefully put it on the other side of the windscreen. I've got a little bit of rag here so it should sit on there without causing any problems. There we go. The next part of the job will be this front shroud area. To start off with, I'll remove this cold air intake. I then have to remove these pipes from the oil cooler. In my case this is a jig fitting. On a normal car I think they're a BSP fitting instead, so I've got these nice aluminium spanners that I can use just to take these fittings off. So I just loosen that. With the fitting loosened, I do have a bung that I can put on this hose that hopefully stops the oil leaking out too much. And the same with the oil cooler. I do exactly the same with the other side. And again I have a bung fitting to go into the end. Round here on the engine side I have two more of the jig fittings for the oil cooler. I'm also going to take the distributor cap off now because that's going to be getting in the way. So that just comes off and pops to the side. I'll also disconnect the coil now from the distributor. Easy to forget that when you take the engine out. As before, I've got these oil cooler fittings down here. So the same as before, they've got a little bung on the end to keep the oil in. And this will be the final one up here. That's that part done. I'm going to remove the radiator, the shroud and the oil cooler hoses next. I've already drained the oil and water from the engine. On this car there's a little coolant overflow bottle which we'll take off first. Here I have the top and bottom hose for the radiator, so these just come off by removing the Jubilee clips and then slide it one way, then the other to remove. We also have the same on this side for the lower hose. Again, a 7mm socket should fit most Jubilee clips. For the lower hose I use this very nice little 1/4" ratchet that just sits down there and makes undoing that lower hose clip very easy. With both the clips loose I can remove the bottom hose. On this car I have just one radiator support. This comes off very easily. Again, a 1/2" headed nut, and the same on the side next to the body. We then have the 1/2" head bolts that run down the sides, so we'll remove these next. With the radiator shroud I like to finish with these two uppermost bolts last, and once they're free we can lift the whole assembly out. Just be a little bit careful with these hoses that they don't drop on the bodywork, but hopefully we should be able to lift the whole assembly up and away from the car. You'll see now that with the radiator and shroud removed, that opens things up quite well for us. The next job is to remove the alternator. We need to do this in order to get to the engine mounting bolts underneath. So again, fairly straightforward. We'll just be using two 1/2" spanners to loosen these off. We've then got a plug at the back. And at the front there it's a 9/16 head nut. With all of those nuts and bolts removed and the fitting from the back, you can just slip the fan belt off and lift the whole alternator assembly away from the car. The next part of the job will be the 4 engine mounting bolts that are on each side of the engine. Again, it's a 1/2" head spanner. Once you've removed the nuts, you may find the bolts are hard to get out. What I find helps is a little pin punch like this with a tapered end. If you can get that into one of the holes, you can generally jiggle the fitting slightly until these bolts come free. On the other side here we have the same again, 4 more of the nuts and bolts, and again it's a 1/2" head spanner. On this side I was struggling to get the 2 top bolts out, so what I do is I get my little pin again and I just give that a little twist, and that will just allow the bracket to move to get these last bolts out. There we go. So that's all 8 taken out now. There are a few more fittings to remove on this side of the engine. We've got the water temperature gauge fitting. We've also got the oil pressure gauge takeoff. We've taken the distributor wire from the coil already. We've got the battery feed that's going to the starter motor there. The battery is isolated already. I can leave the starter motor in place when I remove it because it's one of the smaller ones, but I will need to remove the main battery lead there. To start off with, I've got the water temperature gauge fitting. This is a 5/8 head. It will be exactly the same fitting on a MGB with a capillary tube instead. I just happen to use an electronic water gauge in this car. Down here I've got the oil pressure takeoff, and finally right at the bottom I'll be taking off the main lead going to the starter motor. You may have noticed on this car I do have a larger front pulley. As it stands, that pulley won't clear the steering rack when I want to remove the engine. So what I do is take out the 4 bolts either side plus the steering knuckle here to allow the steering rack to drop down a bit further and make it easier for the engine to lift out. On a normal car you probably won't need to do this, but sometimes it can help. It just avoids any damage to the steering rack there when you remove the engine. In order to move this steering rack, I'll just undo the 4 bolts either side. With the 4 lower bolts removed, I can then remove the single bolt that goes across the steering knuckle. And this will allow the steering rack to come free in order to remove the engine. What I do is I remove it from the knuckle first, and then while I'm working on the car, I just use a punch like this one to go back through the bolt holes for the steering rack. And that'll just keep those front wheels in line. There you can see the 2 punches I've just put back through the bolt holes. It just means if I do want to roll the car backwards and forwards, the wheels won't move out to the side. Moving inside the car, we can now take off the gear lever. To start off with, we have the 4 screws that go around the retaining ring. The ring now lifts off. If you lift the gaiter up, you'll see you have 3 half-inch headed bolts. With those 3 bolts and washers removed, we can now draw out the whole gear stick assembly and the second retaining ring down there. You may also need to disconnect the overdrive cable if it runs down there, and also the speedometer cable too. In this car I don't need to, because the speedometer is electronic and there is no overdrive. I'm now going to jack the car up and put it on axle stands. This will allow me to remove the mounting for the transmission and also the manifold from the engine there. You should be able to see here that I've put the front axle stands right on the very edge of the cross member, the idea being that I can still get the engine crane underneath the car there. So that is both the front and the rear up on stands now. Before I work on the car, I always like to give it a bit of a shake, just to make sure it's nice and solid. So I'll be working under the car next. My first job will be removing the exhaust, which is the 2 flange parts here. I'll then remove the prop shaft at the rear, and finally I'll move on to the gearbox mounts. You may not be able to see what I'm doing all that well, but to start off with, I'm going to remove these nuts and bolts from the exhaust. Now you've possibly seen that this is possibly a different system to what's on your car. This is the Moss Taurus Trophy exhaust system. It's got a nice feature, and it's a sort of a flange system all the way through, which does make it nice and easy to remove parts of it in order to remove the engine or any other maintenance. So that's the middle section removed. I can now move into the engine bay and take out the front part. I've got the top part of the exhaust manifold here. The nuts on this are already taken off, so we should just be able to sort of carefully pull it and just twist it to get that out. So moving back onto the floor now, we've got the clutch slave cylinder up here. This doesn't need to be removed. I take it off the gearbox, leaving the hose intact. I just put a zip tie around the plunger to keep it all in place. So I'm not sure if you'll be able to see this or not, but to start with, I'm just gonna get under here and disconnect the plunger. Just take that out, and then it's a 9/16 head on these 2 long bolts. And then this whole assembly can drop away from the car or from the gearbox. And what I'll do is I'll just put a zip tie around each of these to hold that plunger in place and stop it falling out and losing the hydraulic fluid. There we go. It should just sort of hold all that assembly in place with any luck. And then we'll pick up the 2 bolts and that split pin. Now I'm moving towards the rear of the gearbox to undo the 4 nuts and bolts on this prop shaft. I'm going to have to put the camera down in order to do this, so hopefully you might see a bit, but we'll see how it goes. In order to undo these 4 nuts here, I've basically just got an old screwdriver that I use to steady the prop shaft, and then I can just hopefully get the ring on the end of that and undo them. Now you can leave the bolt part in position. I'm just going to slide that back in for now and work round and do all 4. So this is the final nut coming off now. And then what I do is I take just a block of wood, and I use this block of wood to just prop the prop shaft up. It just keeps it out of the way of the gearbox while we remove that part of the car, so that just sits up there like that. There we go. So with the prop shaft removed, we can now start working on the gearbox cross member next. What I tend to do is undo the bolts at the end of the cross member. I then let it drop down using a jack under here in order to get these little nuts off the side. So with our jack in position under the gearbox, we can then just take out these the bolts on the end of the gearbox support. From where I am here, I've actually got a reasonably good view on the these bolts on the gearbox cross member, so I'll see if I can take the rear 2 out, and then what I'll probably have to do is drop the gearbox down a bit in order to get the front 2 out. And then I'm just going to remove the last of these nuts. Okay, and that's the gearbox cross member out of the way. I'm going to leave the jack where it is, and we're going to move around the front now to start putting the latches on the engine. So we're back round to the front of the car again. What I'm going to do is, rather than having this bonnet prop, I'm going to use a bungee to attach the bonnet to the garage door. The reason I do this is just to keep this bonnet prop out of the way of the engine crane. So the next part of the job, we're removing the rocker cover. And we do this in order to get the hoisting straps onto the engine. Personally, I've always lifted the engine out using the front and rear rocker pedestals. It's never ever caused me an issue. I do hear of some people saying that they've had the rocker pedestal, well, the bolt through the rocker pedestal bend the stud. These are ARP studs in this engine, so they are, it's not stronger than usual. I guess the other option is to put a chain all the way around the engine or something similar. You will see that the fitting goes all the way over the nut there. It should give it plenty of strength. So then that pops on. And these are just the same nuts and bolts that hold the exhaust manifold on. So I'll pull them down. I will give them a tighten up with a spanner. There's a bit of flexibility there to allow them to move if required. And that should be everything hoist out. Now before I do that, I will just take a little look around the engine to make sure everything's loose that needs to be loose. Now everything's in place for me to start lifting the engine, so I'll get the crane into position. Just raise it up a bit so it doesn't catch that front. You will see I've not gone too crazy with protection around the bodywork. I just try and be careful, and usually we get away without any damage. So let me just move this into position. What I need to do first of all is to raise the engine up in order to bring it a little bit further over this cross member, and then I can drop the gearbox back down after it's over the rear part of the bodywork. So we're just going to lift and bring it forwards now. So we're going to remove the steering rack, let that drop down. Also now remove the fan mount. I'm just going to see if we can ease the engine forwards very slightly. Okay, so I'm going to raise it up a little bit more. Just try and ease it forwards. Trying to get that gearbox over the rear part of the bodywork. I need to drop it down a little bit. So I'm just trying to ease the engine forward to get that gearbox clear. The rear is unfortunately just a bit stiff. There we go. Okay, so keep pulling it forwards. I'm going to have a look underneath to check it's come free. Okay, so we are clear at the back. Just trying to get around the steering rack. So I think we can lift up a bit now. And then forwards again. Okay. So we're just going to keep doing this and ease the engine forward. And now I can see the rear. I'm just going to put a bit of cloth over the back of the gearbox to stop it scratching the paintwork. There we go. And hopefully now we should be able to lift it clear of the car. I'm nearly done. Oh no, I'm going to put some more stuff in. Sorry. There we go. Okay. And now with the engine clear, we can just drop it down onto its trolley. So just ease this down, minding that front of the car. There we go, that is the engine out.